Now available for pre-order on Kindle. Stop Simping in Cyberspace. Learn how to avoid predatory females in their virtual con games with Stop Simping in Cyberspace. Pre-order your copy of Stop Simping in Cyberspace on Kindle today. Last week, I did a review of Konkret Comics' Decimation Earth. Unfortunately, because I had the fan going as I was making the video, what happened was the fan wound up drowning out most of the audio of that review. So I want a lot of comic readers and aspiring comic writers who watch the channel to learn from the mistakes that were made in Decimation Earth so that they won't wind up making it in their comics. So that's why I've decided to remake this video, because there are a lot of lessons to learn about many of the mistakes made in Decimation Earth. Now, unlike other Konkret comics like Absolver, Odina, and Acolyte, your Decimation Earth has some serious technical issues. And what the big problem is with Decimation Earth is, while you get a fantastic cover featuring a crack team similar to Doc Savage, what you get on the interior does not match what's on the cover. Now, that's the first mistake made with Decimation Earth. It gives you this very fantastic cover that gives you this crack team of Doc Savage type explorers. Unfortunately, when you get inside of the book, you don't get to meet any of these people that are presented on the cover. Now, that's a major problem for a publisher, because that misleads the reader into thinking that they're going to get something that they're not going to get. So you definitely do not want to go out here, put a great cover on a book, and then not deliver. Now, as we get into the interior of Decimation Earth, there is a real problem with the story. Now, instead of giving us a splash page featuring the main character, what we get is a long expository sequence. Now, the book starts out here with an opening shot with a quote from H.P. Lovecraft talking about 40,000 BC, an eagle, and then it pans down to a group of cavemen. And this is a complete waste of a page, and one of the big problems with Decimation Earth is page management. Now, when you're doing a comic and you are trying to introduce your concept to the reader, you have less than 3 pages to get that reader into your story, because your first issue has to leave a strong first impression on the reader, and you have to answer 3 questions in that first 3 pages. Who is the main character? What do they want to do? What conflict is in front of them? And most importantly, why should we care? It's hard to care about Decimation Earth because on the first page, we get an H.P. Lovecraft quote, and we get some sort of shots of an eagle. Then we get a shot of some cavemen, and this expository sequence of cavemen goes on for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages, and that's about a good 1/3 of the book. And 1/3 of the book, and you don't have any story moving, that's a serious problem for a publisher, because once you get into a book and you don't see the story moving, what the reader is going to do when they see an expository drawn out sequence like this is they're going to wind up putting that book back on the shelf, and they're going to move on to other publications. And this is the big mistake that was made with Decimation Earth, is that the publisher is so focused on trying to put in all of these expository sequences that they're not really thinking about how this is going to be perceived by the reader. Because the reader is going to sit there, and after reading 8 pages of exposition, they are going to wind up putting the book down and then walking away from that book, because that book isn't really showing them what was promised on the cover. I mean, let's look at this again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pages, and we don't get to see any of the fantastic characters that are on the cover of this book. And that's not something you want to do with your publication. You don't want to go out here introduce a fantastic concept on your cover and then not give that to the reader. I mean, what I'm seeing here right here with this expository sequence is an attempt to go and pursue what I call the Brian Michael Bendis story model, where you're going to have this protracted, drawn out story sequence as related to the origin of the team. And that does not really work in today's comic book market, because in today's comic book market, again, you only get one chance to make a first impression on the reader. And if you don't do it within the first 3 pages of the book, then the reader is going to put the book down. And you don't want the reader putting the book down, because if the reader puts the book down, you're not going to get a sale. Now, after we go through this caveman sequence, we then get a sequence taking us to 1924. And in 1924, we've got a professor and his assistant going to go dig through some graves for the Necronomicon. And as they go looking for the Necronomicon, we then get them running into some sort of Lovecraft-style menace and some sort of bad guy. But again, we don't see any of the members of the team that is supposed to form. And again, this is another sequence that just eats up pages. I mean, let's look at how many pages this sequence eats up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages. And again, the reader is not seeing any of the members of that team that they were promised on the cover. And the less that they see of what they were promised on the cover, the more aggravated the reader is going to get, because they're going to say to themselves, why should I spend $3.99 on this book if this book is not going to give me what it promised on the cover? And this is the mistake that the producers of Decimation Earth make with their comic. They wind up not delivering on many of the goods that were promised in their book. Now, as this book goes on after this sequence with the Doc Savage style adventurers and the cavemen, we then go into another sequence where we finally go into this so-called republic in the year 2040-something or so. And then we get that expository sequence and some sort of mission. But by that point, you're already frustrated because you spent most of this time with all of these expository sequences, and all of these expository sequences do not really deliver on giving you what you were promised on the cover. So this Decimation Earth, really, it's one of those examples of an attempt to try to turn a screenplay into a comic, I think. And what they're trying to do with these sequences is they're trying to take storyboards and turn them into a comic. Unfortunately, the writers of Decimation Earth really don't understand that the comic book is a completely different medium. And in the comic medium, you have to condense things so that the reader can come into the story almost immediately. Because it looks like to me they were trying to go out here and take the cinematic shots and then turn it into a comic. But what we get is a long, bloated sequence that goes absolutely nowhere for 2 different characters. And by the time we get to the 3rd or the 4th, we just don't care anymore. And this is the big problem with Decimation Earth, is it doesn't answer that critical question of why should we care? And any good novelist, any good screenwriter, and any good comic book writer knows you have to answer the question of why should we care as soon as possible, because the faster that the reader cares, the faster you're going to make a sale, because comics are a sales business, and this book, Decimation Earth, does not really do a good job of selling itself. No, Decimation Earth actually dissuades the reader from going to buy the book because you don't get what is promised in the first issue. I mean, I'm going to give you another example of another kind of book that does the team building. I think I have it in here. It's called Metal Shade, and I bought it off of Kickstarter a while back. And Metal Shade uses a similar story model to your Decimation Earth. But Metal Shade, as it comes out here, builds up the team very quickly, and it goes out here and it does not pad out all the issues too much. I mean, Metal Shade, you get to meet all the characters in one issue, and then in the second issue, you start to see that after the team forms, they then go out and start working towards the mission. So Decimation Earth looks like it tried to use the same type of story model. Unfortunately, they pad things out so much that the reader just winds up getting turned off, and they're just going to get frustrated because you're trying to give me all of your story ideas, but sometimes when you're doing comics, you have to prune those story ideas. That was something I had to do with my first comic, Esteem No Good Deed. Now that story was 11 pages, but I wound up cutting 2 because I wanted the story to flow better, and I wanted the story to be easier for the reader to access, because I understood that comic panels need to move, and I understood that a comic book story needs to have good pacing. And this Decimation Earth has really poor pacing because, again, when you go out here and you have a 9 or 10 page sequence and another 9 or 10 page sequence, you have practically eaten up 2/3 of a comic. And when you eat up 2/3 of a comic and nothing happens, then nothing is going to happen when it's time for you to get that sale. And Decimation Earth probably won't get too many sales because once people read this first issue and have a poor first impression, they're going to wind up getting turned off by this book because this book really does not deliver on what it promised on the cover, which was this Doc Savage style crack team of adventurers who were going to go out here and take on these bad guys. That's what people wanted when they saw the cover, and that's what I expected to get when I looked at this cover. Unfortunately, what I got with Decimation Earth was a bloated, long series of expository sequences about mysterious menaces, cavemen, and a futuristic sort of virus, and I'm still trying to figure out how all of this works. Now, the creators probably thought, oh, we'll be able to explain this later, but in the publishing business, nobody's going to give you a chance to explain things later if they don't get a good understanding of it in the first issue, because the first issue of your book is what's going to sell the second issue, and you need to put as much information as possible that gets me into your anticipating your second book, because if you don't go out here and leave a strong first impression on the reader in the first 3 to 5 pages of your book, then they have no incentive to go out here and buy that second comic book. So this book really fell apart within the first page or so, and what cost this book a lot is going to cost this book a lot of sales is the fact that the creators just did not know how to just go out here and trim stuff down to the very basics. I mean, when it comes down to your novel, you can put a lot of exposition and prose in, but when you get to screenwriting, you have to start condensing things and using the fewest economy of words to tell the most story. And when you get to comics, you have to even condense things even further because each panel needs to tell a story in the picture, and that picture needs to move the story forward. So I didn't see a lot of that with Decimation Earth, and I was deeply disappointed with this comic because the concept on the cover is absolutely fantastic, but what was presented inside of the comic just left such a poor first impression with me that if I had to go out here and buy this comic, I would practically leave it on the shelf and never want to go out here and buy another one because, again, I'm not a fan of this Brian Michael Bendis style padded out storyline. And if you're going to do this type of story, it's not, you're going to wind up losing sales because you have to go out here and in your first issue, make sure you establish all your main characters and all of your story and give people what's on the cover, like the people at Metal Shade did. At least they even though they had a secret closet, they start introducing you to characters, and that's what you do in a good comic. You start giving people the characters so they can get to know them. But I didn't see that with this Decimation Earth, and that's why this book is a really disappointment, because if they just took the time to learn how comics were made, maybe they could have possibly put together a quality story. Now, I can't recommend this comic from Konkret Comics, but Konkret has other fantastic comics on its catalog, like Acolyte, like Absolver, and like the upcoming Candake, and I can recommend you go get those books instead of this one. Now, I'm currently getting ready to launch my own comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, and if you want to help me get that book to print, you can donate to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try out my first comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents on Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.